And I'm also grateful to Dad because of the lessons he did teach me, and that he did show me that this is what the real world is like. So yeah, and I think right now I can say like I'm there's no anger or hurt or bitterness there anymore. There's just love and gratitude, and you know, I know and I'm saying like I'm not obviously 100% happy. There's going to be days where something's going to trigger me. I'm going to hear a song, or I'm going to, like, every time I still sit in a horse, I'm with Dad when I'm on a horse, and I find myself kind of looking around being like, where is he? So there's always going to be those moments where the sadness will peer up and be there, but that's grief. Like, that's, as I said, it's with you for the rest of your life, and it's just learning how to deal with it now, and how to kind of deal with it in a healthy way now that isn't going to damage me or those around me.
Hello and welcome. My name is Liz Gleeson, and you're listening to Shapes of Grief. Shapes of Grief is a curation of stories from international guests who share their unique experience of grief. These stories are shared with the wish that you, the listener, may find some comfort, hope and solidarity, and maybe also the realisation that you're not alone in your grief. Each time you listen, please do support the podcast by donating on the website shapesofgrief.com or by becoming a patron on patreon.com. It's a privilege to hold these conversations, and I extend my deepest gratitude to all my guests for showing up in this particular way. It truly is a gift. Welcome back to Shapes of Grief, everybody. I'm Liz Gleeson, and I'm delighted to be joined this week by Meghann Scully, author and broadcaster from Limerick. Meghann, you're so welcome.
Oh, well, I'm going to get in trouble now because I'm originally from Galway, but Limerick is home now. But I think Limerick has adopted me, and Limerick people are not going to let me go.
That sounds lovely. Meghann, you've got quite an unusual story in that at a very young age you suffered from significant losses, and several of them what we would call, as you know, grief therapists would call bereavement overload. Can we go back to the days when things were normal? What did your family look like?
I suppose we never really had a normal family. Well, I think actually, I suppose back in the 80s, maybe it was, Mum and Dad are both from a village and a town in Galway, and did the whole thing of getting married and moving up to Dublin, which back in the 80s was there, everyone did that. It was like straight up to Dublin. Got a house in Dundrum, which it's so funny now because I'm like, I was actually born in Dundrum, but I was like obviously pre-shopping centre when Dundrum was just a small village, and it was I'm pretty sure in the neighbourhood everyone was from Clare, Roscommon, Mayo, Leitrim. It was all country people that had come up to Dublin. So a lot of our neighbours were kind of, I suppose it kind of had that real country feel to it, because it still had that open door policy, and you know, you just kind of sauntered in and out anyone's houses. And it was a lovely little community that we built up there. And I remember the housing estate that we were in was new enough, so it was all young families. So there was a green in the middle, and sure, all the kids would be all out playing. So we had that real nice suburban lifestyle. So I guess I remember those few years, but my parents then separated when I was around 3 or 4. And it's really funny because a lot of people say to me I have a very vivid childhood memories, but I think it probably goes back to childhood trauma, that instead of maybe suppressing the memories, they're very vivid for me. So I remember my dad moving out, and he had a maroon and white horse box, because when it came to the horses or came to anything, our team colours were always maroon and white for Galway. So Dad had the maroon and white horse box, backed into the front door and filling it up with all his stuff. And I remember then being about 3, like couldn't have been much more, and I remember actually carrying his stuff out to the horse box, and I remember feeling really important because I was helping him with stuff. But I guess I didn't realise the significance of it. But standing at the door was Mum roaring crying, because this was obviously the end of the marriage. So there was a lot of those tears and a lot of emotion that time from Mum. Mum was 21 getting married, and by 29 she was separated with 2 small kids. And it's funny now that I'm in my early 30s, I'm worlds away from that. And when I was 29, I remember saying that to her. I was like, how did you do it? Yeah. It's just crazy. And then she kind of realised then that she didn't want Marcus and I to grow up in Dublin away from family, because all the family, my mum's one of 11. She's comes from a farm, 11 kids. She's number 3 in the family. My baby auntie Roisin was, I think, 11 when I was born, so we are quite close in age. So Mum wanted us to grow up around them, and she just decided, okay, I'm going back to Galway. And we packed up and left our lovely house in Dundrum, and we rented a chalet in Spiddle in Connemara. And I remember at the time I thought this is the coolest place ever, because it was like, I think, a couple of 100 yards from the beach. So for me to get to school every day, I had to walk past the beach. And then more often than not, I guess because we came from Dublin and we were in the suburbs, we didn't have a beach as plentiful. I know there is beaches nearby, but we didn't really go to them. But then suddenly we had a beach on our doorstep every day, so we were constantly swimming. Like it felt like a real free time. And I think Mum and I often reflect on Spiddle, and we call Spiddle our spiritual home, because for a couple of years it was only Mam, Marcus and I, and it was very special. Dad didn't really come near us and didn't really have much involvement in our lives when we lived in Spiddle. I think Mam said it was 6 months before he came to see us. So we kind of built this community in Spiddle. And again, we were blow-ins. We didn't speak Irish, and parents were separated. So it was very, I remember, I think at the time we possibly were the only kids who had a separated family, because I think even in the early 90s it wasn't really done. Like, I think a lot of parents maybe stayed together.
You were 3. How old was Marcus at that time?
Marcus was 5, and he really took on the kind of man of the house role at that age.
Yeah. I mean, like you say, 30 years ago nearly, divorce was not a thing in Ireland. Like, it's still, like, for anyone, we've quite an international audience, for anyone listening, you know, divorce was only legalised in Ireland about 18 years ago, I think, or maybe 20 years ago. And because we come from such a Catholic culture where divorce is forbidden, it's still very much taboo, you know. I'm divorced, and I'm you know, a few of my friends are separated, but it's not common. It's really not common. I think the figures in Ireland are about 8% of marriages end in divorce, whereas in the States it's 55% as far as I know. So just to put it into context, while now in Ireland it's becoming more normalised, if you like, 30 years ago it wasn't. But I'm really struck, Meghann, I got the feels there when you're describing the horse box backed up the driveway, and just the symbolism of that, and your dad putting his stuff into it, and you say you've a lot of memories of that time.
Yeah, really strong memories. And I think it's because I think I always tried to be Daddy's girl. I forced myself to be Daddy's girl, and I kind of, Dad was very much so children should be seen and not heard kind of a father. He came from a very strict household himself, and very much so strict with us. And, you know, we were very much so afraid of him growing up. I would have said we were very fearful of Dad always, even though he wasn't actually really strong. Like, he wasn't really in our lives as small kids, but he had this effect on us. So Marcus and I loved each other, but also fought like cats and dogs. And then Mum would be like, I'm ringing your father. And as soon as she'd say you're ringing the father, like, she'd go into the room to go get the phone. And Marcus and I'd be like, please don't, we won't, we'll stop. And like, she was with us 24/7. Dad was living up in Kildare with his new girlfriend, and we were on our own in Spiddle. We were ages away, and this was before all the motorways. And he had that effect on us that he could, and then sometimes we would have to go on the phone to him, and it would just, the tone of his voice, we were petrified of him. And I remember even going to spend holidays with him in Kildare, and always, no one used my father, wanting to be Daddy's girl, but also being very fearful of him and never wanting to, like, ask for anything. Or I could be starving, and I'd be too scared to ask for food.
So not a good start at all.
No, quite like tough, like really tough. And then, whereas at Mum, I'd be like going in and helping myself, or I'd be in the shop pulling sweets off the shelf. And well, I think, like, I do often look back in our childhood and I say that we had two very different childhoods. Mum really sheltered us and tried her best to shelter us, whereas Dad was like, well, no, this is what real life is like. So very traumatic childhood, but then also very much so mollycoddled by our mother. And my mother, I often, like, I know, I suppose it is a mother's thing to give love anyways, but Mum, I just always felt was just tried to do as much as she could to make sure that everything for us was easy and everything was gentle and everything was kind of wrapped in cotton wool in such a way, I suppose, and very much so wanted to make sure that we had an innocent childhood, because I think she was very, I guess she knew that Dad had his grievances himself, and I think she was not that she didn't trust him with us, but she just was like, I'm going to keep them as children as much as I could, whereas Dad was like, no, they have to learn, this is what life is like.
There's the guilt of separation and divorce as well. As a separated mother, I know that, where you're trying to just make sure your children have a childhood and have a youth, and you know, while reality is reality, you're also trying to make it better for them. And you know, sometimes women, we end up being both parents a lot of the time. So I can understand where your mum was coming from. So difficult start, Meghann, it sounds like, which was to become even more difficult when you were 14.
Yeah, and it's funny, I remember actually probably when I was around 13, 14, pre the big trauma, I remember one time thinking, so Dad, we ended up moving to Ardrahan, which is where Mam is from, so next door to Granny, we built a house. Dad ended up moving to Galway and ended up buying a house in Galway in Crockwell, which is I think 4 miles away from Granny's house. So we kind of came full circle and we all ended up back in Galway, literally next door neighbours. And then Mam and Dad actually became really good friends, and it was really unusual for us initially, because separated parents, you know, they sometimes say, oh, aren't meant to get on. Well, Mam and Dad became really good friends, as in the love wasn't there, genuinely the relationship wasn't there, but the friendship was there, and they started like having great crack together. And my friends would call over after school and they'd be like, your parents got on really well. I was like, yeah, I know. I was like, I don't understand either. And they're like, but they're separated. And I was like, yeah. And they're like, our parents are married and don't even get on that well. I was like, I know. I was like, I think it's genuine, because now they both realise they weren't meant to be together, and they both realise they're actually better apart. And it was really nice. Then Marcus started secondary school. He went to Garbley in Ballinasloe, and then I started the local convent in secondary school. And I remember that point in life thinking, oh my God, everything was just suddenly falling into place. I was doing well at school, Marcus was doing well at school, we were doing well at sport, Dad was in a good place, his health was good, he, you know, had started up an auctioneering business. Mam was going through her college degree, because she got married so young that she never got her education, and she went back as a mature student. And
your father had significant health issues. That's just what you're referring to there.
Yeah.
You say Dad's health was good.
Yeah, Dad would have had a kidney transplant when he was 21, which again was back in the early 70s, I think it was, so very unheard of in Ireland and very risky.
So he lived through his own traumas, which could explain some of his behaviour.
Yeah, definitely. And he's like, poor Dad, like I think like Dad suffered so much with his health, and so like I always say he never really got a chance to live, even though he did his best. His health was always holding him back from, you know, whereas he could go on holidays with his friends, but he didn't have as much energy as his friends would have had, because they wouldn't have had the underlying issues he had. And he but he still always made the most of situations. Like if there was ever you only live once for someone, it was definitely my father. And you know, and then that's why I say when things were going well for him, like his health was good and he was managing his health, and we the horses going together as well, so we were competing together. And I remember that 13, 14 thinking, oh, everything's really kind of settled. And then Marcus and I then had developed a relationship with Dad where we were no longer afraid of him. Still a little bit like wouldn't cross him, but we were able to like have conversations with him, we were able to hang out with him, we were able to talk to him, whereas previously it was like, don't say anything, just stay quiet and don't make him angry. Whereas now we'd kind of be like, oh, Dad's in a bad mood, leave him off there, and kind of, you know, we could have a bit more crack. So at that point I actually remember to this day that day as well, where I remember thinking, things are going pretty well for all of us, this is really nice. And then that's when the tragedy struck. So
what happened, Meghann?
So I was in my junior cert year, and I had just finished my junior cert mocks, and it was a Friday. Marcus had finished his leaving cert mocks on the Wednesday, and because he was at a boarding school, he got to come home early. So he was at home. I remember that Friday night he was going back to rugby training. He'd previously had like an injury, so was out for a few weeks, and I was going horse riding that night with Dad, and it was like two of us really excited. We finished our mocks. I was not a studier. Marcus wanted to be a vet, so he was a studier. So every weekend he was at home from school, we had to it was Marcus's routine. So it was breakfast, study, break, study, break, study, hurling, study, rugby. And I remember on many occasions I'd go up to the living room and turn on the TV, and next minute I'd hear the feet coming. I'm like, oh no, pull the remote off, my TV off, get back, you're studying? And I was like, just the junior cert. And he was like, I don't care. You start it now. You laid the foundations now. And I was like, well, I don't want to be a vet. I don't need 600 points.
So he really looked out for you, Meghann.
Very much so. Very protective. Very strict with me in a fatherly sense, because I guess with Dad not being there, Marcus felt he had to look after me. So when I was going to a disco, it was Marcus I had to go to first for an outfit inspection, not my mother. And he'd see my skirt and be like, you're not going out in that. Take that off. Put on trousers. I'm like, no, everyone's wearing skirts.
This is your 16-year-old brother.
Yeah.
Wow.
And like my mum was like, well, Marcus, to be fair, like all the girls are wearing them. And he was like, not my sister. So like, fine. So
what was that like for you? Did you like that he cared, or?
I was time being so annoyed because all the girls were wearing skirts, but I used to put the skirt out the window and then put on the trousers, walk out the door, and then Mam would take the skirt into the car for me. So we kind of both fooled him. Mam didn't mind, but Marcus did. And he used to use the threatening, I'm going to tell Dad what you're wearing and he'll never go to a disco again. And I was like, oh my God, please don't. So I had the two of them. But he was very protective of me, but also
that's lovely,
very mindful, and very, was laying a structure for me as much as him.
Where did he get it from?
I don't actually know. It's funny. That's what the separation, Dad leaving so young, did that to him. Which maybe that kind of laid the foundations for him stepping up into the man role, I guess. But he did write a poem when he was in Garbally, and it was how he went into Garbally a boy and was leaving a man. So he felt that Garbally kind of solidified him and is the place that made him into the man that he was.
So school had a huge influence on him as well.
Absolutely.
And he brought that home to you?
Yeah, and he was in a boarding school, and I think I still think about that boarding school and how the kind of brotherhood they had. I still meet boys from Garbally and they're just, I've always said it, there's something about them, they're just pure gents, and they're such a band of brothers. They really care for each other, they really look out for each other, but they also very much so put each other in place as well. If someone's doing something that the rest of them would pull them up in it, and I think that's where he got it from as well. And then he'd come home to me, and then suddenly I was like, oh my God, I'm not in boarding school, what's going on?
It sounds amazing. I know a few people who could do with going down to Gardley. I'll be googling that later. So what happened that Friday, Meghann?
So I got home from school and I got in the door and Mum was ironing Marcus's brand new shirt they bought that day in Galway. And so Marcus was definitely a mammy's boy. She was Mam at the time was going through a vegetarian phase, and that every weekend when Marcus got back from Garbally he wanted steak. So steak for Marcus, chicken for me, and vegetarian for her, and she would cook the 3 dinners because to suit the 3 of us. And I used to be like, would you not just make the one thing? And she's like, well no, Marcus wants steak and you want chicken and I'm vegetarian. And so that's the way she did it. And she was ironing the shirt, and then he came in and he was really excited because our neighbour and our friend who we'd grown up with had gotten his first car. And Marcus is like, Mum always drove them to training, that was the thing. But then she's like, since while he was injured, Cathal got a new car. So Marcus like, Cathal's got a car, he's insured, oh my God, and the 2 of them were 18 and Cathal's going to drive me to training. And Mum's like, no, sure, I can drive you. But no, we're going together, man. I'm not going with my mum. And it was kind of like it was stepping into adulthood, I suppose, and being men. So Mum actually drove Marcus up to the neighbour's house that night, which is about 200 metres from the house, maybe 300, he could have walked, but she wanted to drop him up, and she dropped him up that night, and the 2 mothers had a cup of tea and were kind of saying, isn't it such a big step, the boys going off together and not having to have your parent driving you up, and such a big moment. And Mam always says how Marcus, we always do hugs and I love you, we're always an I love you hug house. And Marcus gave Mam a hug, goodbye Mam, I love you, walked out the door, put his stuff in the car, came back into the house, came back in, grabbed her and hugged her, and she said it was the biggest squeeze. He gave her this big huge embrace and says, goodbye Mam, I love you, and walked out the door. In the meantime, Dad collected me and he was teaching us horse riding, and it's kind of a bit of a crazy story, but he collected me and he was late, and Dad was teaching the lesson, and I jumped in the lorry and I was like, hi, and I knew when Dad was late, you just didn't say you're late, so I just sat there and was like, he's late and he's in a bad mood. And then I looked and there was like a handkerchief full of blood up on the dashboard of the lorry, so I was like, oh God. And then I kind of tried to glance at him without staring because I knew he was in a bad mood, and his head was split open, and I was like, oh, what happened? And he was trying to load the horse, and basically the horse wouldn't go up the lorry, and then Dad decided to ride him up the lorry, and then the horse clipped Dad's head off the top of the lorry. anyone would have went straight to hospital, but Dad's like, I'm teaching the lesson and that's it. Very stubborn man. So we got to the lesson and all the parents looked at Dad and said, you're going to hospital, like you're not teaching lesson. Dad's like, I'm fine, it's just a bit of blood. And everyone was like, no, you're literally pumping blood. And Dad's like, that Dad though, he'd nearly need a limb falling off, like he still stay going. And then one parent said, no, you're not taking the lesson. If you go into the arena, we're taking our kids home, you're going to the doctor. So anyways, after a bit of a kind of a commotion, one of the parents said, I'm taking the lesson, Maxie, you're going. So I remember I had a stallion at the time, and the stallion was beautiful big black horse. It was Dad's horse, but we shared him. And then everyone was freaked out because Dad was gone and I was the stallion on my own, and I was like, it's fine. So then the parents were all watching the stallion, and we were just doing a little bit of show jumping, and my friend and I were standing in the corner on our horses, and next minute it was kind of gone dark at this stage, and I saw an ambulance go out the road towards Gort, and I was like, oh my God, it's Dad, because Dad had gone to the doctor's surgery. And then next time I was kind of panicking, and then I looked up and there was Dad, top of the arena, bandage, big white bandage wrapped around his head, and I was like, oh, it's fine, Dad's fine, carry on with the lesson. Then next minute where we were, I saw the Loughrea road, and then the Loughrea to Gort road, there was an ambulance going in that road. So that's a bit unusual on a Friday night, 2 ambulances out. Now they had blue flashing lights on, they didn't have their sirens on. And the place where I was horse riding is kind of up on a hill between Gort and Ardrahan, and Marcus had gone to Gort to rugby. We got home then that evening, and Mam was completely flustered. She was just not herself. And she goes, Marcus isn't answering his phone, he's meant to be home, he said he'd be home at 9 o'clock, why is he not home? And it was 9:05. I was like, Mam, it's 9:05. I was like, he's back to rugby training, he's with the lads, they're probably gone for a little spin around the town, I was like, it's just they're boys. And she goes, no, something's wrong, something's happened. And I was like, what is she on about? And then people started ringing the house being like, hey, is Marcus there? And I was like, no, it's still rugby training. Okay, thanks, bye. And then we're like, oh, whatever, it's a bit unusual. And the next minute Mam just said, I'm ringing the neighbours, or the other boy's house. And then she rang and they said there's been an accident. And then Mam just collapsed on the floor, and I was like, what did they say? She goes, there's been an accident. And I said, did they say it was Cathal or Marcus? She goes, they just said there's an accident. I said, you don't know what's Cathal or Marcus. Said it could have been anyone, they could be stuck behind the accident. And of course, again, me being the ever optimist, so Mum said, no, I need to go. Like, so the Mum was like, no, we need to get out of here. So we went over to Granny's house, and then she walked in, and Mam was at this stage was completely in hysterics. And then Granny was there, and she goes, Marcus has been in an accident. And then Granny went up the hallway, and then she fell on the ground, so I pulled her up, and I was like, will you just stop? I said, you don't know anything, you've just heard an accident, you don't know.
And Meghann, I'm going to remind you to breathe.
Yes.
Because I can see just how charged it was that night there.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you're this kid pulling everyone up off the ground. So when did you find out that it was your brother and his friend? Then
my granny said, Peter, my uncle is down in the pub. The village we all live, we're all stones throw from each other. So I was like, right, I'll run down and get him. And I ran out the driveway, and as I was running out, Peter came up against me. I was like, hey, how are you? I was like, apparently there's been an accident. And he was like, yeah, and he's your typical country farmer, doesn't really say much, but does things. That's his love language is definitely acts of service. So Peter just came there and he goes, sure, get in my car there, and sure, we'll go up to the neighbour's house. So I was like, okay. But in the meantime, I was actually meant to go to a sleepover, so I had my little overnight bag. So I was like, 'cause I was still going to sleepover. So I brought it with me, and I was like, oh, I'll just throw it in the car because maybe Peter will drop me to sleep over. So then we went up to the neighbour's house, and that's when we were there. They all came out, and they were all really upset, their family. And we were kind of like, what's going on? And we were like, is it Cathal or Marcus? And they were like, yeah, it was. And we were like, well, what's going on? Like, we hadn't been told anything. And then in the meantime, I said, okay, I'll ring Dad. And I rang Dad, and I was like, hey. And he was like, hey. And he's like, look, there's been an accident. I'm on the way into the hospital. And I was like, how does he know? So and then it turns out it kind of feels like, looking back now, everyone knew except us, and all those phone calls we were getting to the house were all people who knew, and were ringing to see if we knew, and then nobody basically had the courage, I think, to tell us. So while we were standing in the front garden of our neighbour's house, the doctor and the dad had come down from the crash site, and like tragically Cathal lost his life on impact, the driver and our neighbour. So they went into the house obviously to have that moment. So we stayed out in the garden, my mum, my uncle and I, and while we were there, an ambulance flew past, sirens on, blaring, and then our GP came out to us to leave the family. And obviously we were like, how's Marcus? Because he's like, Cahill's dead. And we couldn't believe it because we grew up with Cahill as well. So then we said, and how's Marcus? And he said, oh no, he said he's walking and talking, he seems to be fine. He's gone in there now. So we were like, oh, okay. So jumped in the car. Peter was like, I'll drive us in. And then we stopped along the way to get petrol, and I went in with Mum and I picked up some Mars bars because at the time they were Marcus's favourite chocolate. So I said, Mars bars. When he wakes up now, give him chocolate. Joe thinking sugar or chocolate, what he'll want. And on the conversation on the way into hospital that evening was like, he's got his leaving cert now in a few weeks. Like his best friend's after dying beside him. What should we do? Will we tell him? Will we not tell him? What if he's like broken a leg and can't play rugby? If he can't play rugby, he'll be devastated. If he can't sit the leaving cert, he'll be so upset because he was so driven and motivated and sporty. And we got into the hospital. Then we were brought into A&E, and I remember going into the A&E and looking around, and I was like, God, I know a lot of people in here tonight. And it was like neighbours were in there and people from around, and we were like, this is really strange. God, it's a really busy night in A&E for people from Ardrahan and Gort. And then eventually Dad was in there too, and again still bandaged up, and the blood I think was starting to come through. And then Mum and us Dad were demanding we need to see our son. Again, I was like, why is he? So then they brought us through the double doors, we'll say, in A&E, and they pointed to the resuscitation room, and they're like, oh, he's in there. And I was like, why is he in the resuscitation room? And they were like, oh no, that's where we bring everyone initially. When you come in, you go straight in there. So they brought us into another little room, a private room, and Mum and Dad were literally demanding we want to see our son. And obviously the doctor's nurse was like, no, we'll get you to see him. Mum was like, I want to see my son now. So I was kind of like, why are they being so, like, Mum and Dad, I was like, why are they being so bothered? I was like, relax, like, clearly this is what they do. And Mum and I used to watch ER every Sunday, so obviously very much so conditioned by US television and how ER works. And then they brought us in, they let us come in to see him, and they said to us, he has to go for surgery, so you can see him. So we went into the room, and I remember he kind of moved his head, and I went, oh, he's awake. And the nurse goes, no, she goes, that's the tube. And I was like, oh, okay. And then Mum made a beeline to go run at him. And I remember then the doctors were like, careful, because there was just tubes everywhere. They're like, they're literally his lifelines. Don't stand on the tubes. So I remember, like, I was taking all this in. Mum and Dad were up at his head and telling him they loved him and chatting to him. And I was kind of I think I was more so listening to everything that was going on. Mm-hmm. And then Mum, they were hysterical, and I was kind of looking at him, and he was, at this stage he was unconscious. It was the tubes, and I think they said they had to put him into an induced coma. So then Mum goes, come up. So I went up, and I just went down to him, and I whispered in his ear, and I was like, I got you Mars bars, so after surgery I've got Mars bars for you. Okay, I'll talk to you in a while. And that's all I said, because I genuinely was giving him his chocolate after surgery, and we were told the next 2 hours were critical. So we all went back out into the waiting room, and this stage more people from around had come in, and Marcus's friends were there, and then my friends started arriving in, and I was like,
into the hospital,
into the A&E, into the waiting room, and I was like, what's going on? I was like, is everyone like coming in with broken bones? And then again a bit oblivious, and people were like, no, they're here for Marcus. And I was like, oh, it's a bit strange. I was like, why are they all here for Marcus? And then as I said, my mum is one of 11, so half the aunts and uncles came into A&E, and the other half went down to my auntie Fanula's house, I believe, and they brought Granny down there, because I think they didn't want to all come into A&E, and I think they didn't want to bring Granny in there, so they brought Granny down there. So the family, it was half and half. And then,
I mean, it sounds like a film set, Meghann.
It really was.
Like ER and all the neighbours and relatives and friends coming in.
Yeah, and it's funny how strong those memories are. And as the night progressed, or I remember like every 15 minutes we look up at the clock and we're like, oh, another 15 minutes now. And we were all like, so by the kind of towards the end of the night, everyone in A&E, even if they weren't part of us, were part of us. So everyone was watching the clock, and it kind of became this thing that, oh, you know, we're all counting down together, and like half an hour, or an hour and a half now, and an hour and 50 now. Oh, we're down to an hour now. And
so it's almost like everybody else knew the severity of what was going on, but you were in some surreal bubble that was going to feed him Mars bars once he woke up.
And I think looking back now, I'm like, oh yeah, everyone, clearly because Cahill died, everyone knew this was a lot more severe. But like, we'd heard so many crazy stories that, well, it turns out Marcus got cut out of the car. So I think we were told he was roughly an hour getting cut out. We're told that the other car that they hit into, that they had more facial, like physical injuries that could be seen, and apparently Marcus looked fine, and Marcus apparently kept saying he was fine. Obviously he was in shock. Someone else told me that Marcus knew Cahill was dead beside him, and was like, okay, right, I just need to get out of this car. So apparently when he got cut out, he walked. The ambulance were there to put him into the trolley. But at this stage, like, the amount of people that we know that were there that night at the crash with Marcus is, it kind of blows my mind that so many people were there. Mum's friends, my friends, dad's, like dad's friend that rang him was his childhood best friend that was at the scene. The rugby teammates, they were one of the first ones on the scene because they were obviously all coming out from training.
It's a small Irish village, so this something like this would impact everybody. Yeah, because everybody would have known the boys. And
from what I've gathered, people just got out of their cars. Everyone just, it was a standstill because at the time there was no motorway, so that was the main Limerick Ennis Cork road, and apparently the place was standstill. So apparently everyone just got out of their cars and came over, and then a lot of people have said to us that Marcus walked from the car into the ambulance, and apparently he was in the ambulance, his phone was ringing and he was trying to get out his phone because everyone was ringing him, because I suppose everyone was trying to mam everyone, and apparently his phone was in his pocket but he couldn't really get to it. And someone that lives across the road actually travelled into the ambulance with Marcus that night, and to this day Mam still hasn't spoken to him, and I'm like, Mam, please, like, let me speak to him, because like, I want to know the conversation, because I want to know what happened, what did he say, what did he do, and did he speak, did he not speak, did they put him in induced coma then?
So you haven't had that conversation with that man?
No. And
has he offered?
Yeah, he's offered to Mum a few times, and Mum said, I'm not ready. And I was like, Mam, do it before it's too late. I was like, it's going to hurt. She said, but let's just get it over and done with. Let's find out. Like, he could have said something insignificant. He could have said something significant. Maybe he spoke, because we don't know, because we didn't know, like, that whole hour that he was sitting inside in that car, we didn't know what was going on. So for Mum and I, and Dad actually as well, there is a kind of there was an anger surrounding why weren't we called up that night, and why weren't we brought up, and why weren't we, like, allowed to be with him for that hour. Now maybe we probably wouldn't have wanted to see what was there, but if he was awake and talking for that long, it would have probably maybe been part of the journey to be there with him, because by the time we saw him in hospital he was in a coma. So as the time went on, the mum said to the surgeons or the doctors, she said, I want to be as close to the surgery as possible. Like, I want to be there beside him. So Mam, Dad, and if some of Dad's family, some friends, again, everyone was all little in pods, went up, and it was on this, like, second floor in the hospital. And I was like, I'll stay down in A&E. So I stayed down the main thing. And then one of my aunties came down, and it was like, we were down to the last 15 minutes. And it must have been like 2 o'clock in the morning at this stage. And at this stage, A&E was very busy with all of us. And my aunt came down, she goes, oh, Meghann. And I was like, oh yeah. And she goes, you come with me now? And I went, okay. And then everyone was like, and I remember at the time everyone was like, oh. And then I was like, jeez, he must be awake. So I went and I remember she held my hand, and I was like, oh, is he awake? And she goes, I don't know. I just said I'd come down. I was told to come down and get you, and I was like, bring you up to Pauline and Maxine. And I was like, oh, okay, grand. So I went up to the second floor, and never forget the time, because they're all saying hospitals, there's loads of bed shortages. I went into this like ward, and it was completely empty, all dressed beds but fully empty, and there was Dad lying down on one of the beds because his head from earlier was like killing him. So I didn't even the hospital possibly offered to do something that night, and Dad's like, I'm fine. So Dad was like laid out in the bed, and then a few of us were just kind of floating around, and then next minute then the doctor and the nurse came in. I remember Dad got up, and we're all standing there. So 3 of us were standing together, and then the rest of the family were kind of, I suppose, standing with us but away from us. And that's when the surgeon came out, and he kept going on about all his injuries and naming out everything that happened and all the internal bleeding. And I was like, yeah, okay. And then you get to the point, because ER and they say, but he survived. So I was kind of standing there being like, hey, yeah, we get it, very injured, yeah, we'll get through that, leave insert, okay, we'll figure that out. And then he's like, I'm sorry, he didn't survive. And I remember standing there being like, that's not what they say on the television. And then Mam just collapsed, and then Dad collapsed, and then he was trying to hold her, and then I remember then everyone just started grabbing everyone. And I remember then everyone started grabbing me, and I remember thinking, like, get off me. I don't want anyone to touch me. And I was like, because again, I was like, this isn't happening. I was like, this isn't real.
It's just such a profound tragedy.
It was just, I think being so young and being 15, and Marcus and I had all these plans for a leaving cert, and he was going to do Budapest to do veterinary if he didn't get UCD. Like, he'd applied for all of these because he was so well organised, and so, but he had a plan. Like, he'd designed the house that he wanted to build for himself. He had this girl that was in the UK that he got on really well with. They had a plan, if by a certain age they both weren't with people, they were going to get married and have kids. So like, he had all these plans, whereas I was like, when's the next disco? Do you know? And he had all these future plans. So that's where it kind of, I guess at the time, it was like, this doesn't make sense. But then that night in the hospital, apparently then the aunt that brought me up was with us when we got the news. So she went down, and she walked into A&E, and apparently she just walked in and everyone looked up and she was like, no, I didn't make it. And then apparently like that's how everyone started to find out. But then Mum again was like, I just want to see my son. So they said, look, we'll do that for you. So they brought us then to a private room and another part of the hospital. I feel like I was in every part of the hospital that night. And Dad and I went in first, and like he was only dead about half an hour, but he was still like colour was still in his cheeks. He genuinely looked like he was asleep. And it was funny, he had this like mole on his face, or as Mum always says, the beauty spot. And it always bothered him. Like Marcus was, not that he was like into his image, but he very much so would have the hair gelled well and always dressed very well and liked his good clothes, and you know, liked to look after himself, liked his aftershave. Like at the weekends the house would just, like the Hugo Boss would be lingering because he would be dousing himself in it, and he was so neat and tidy, and I was just such a mess. And then the man was looking at him, Mum was like, where's his mole gone? And I was like, what? And we looked. So I don't know what happened or how, but in the crash or something, the mole was gone. So the mole that he always used to say, he used to say to Mum, I'm getting that removed. And Mum's like, you're not, it's a beauty spot, you're not getting that removed, you're not touching your face.
Where was it, Meghann?
Just kind of on his cheek. It's just like a cheek, and it wasn't even noticeable, but for him it was. And he used to be like, well, I can't be going on sun holidays with it, you know, just in case. And but it was gone, and it no scratch, no like mark of where it was, just gone. And it was kind of like, I suppose, in the way maybe he knew deep down he was going to be laid out in front of hundreds of people. And it was gone.
So it has some sort of meaning for you and your mum that the mole disappeared.
Yeah, we just thought it was, we kind of laughed sometimes. We're like, oh, well, he wanted to get rid of it anyways, and he did it. I suppose he, like, maybe, well, looking back now, we do think subconsciously he knew what was happening. Like that hug to my mum, that final hug and the goodbye, he spent a day with he's very close to Granny Sadie, like they're a great bond, and he spent the day before fully with her. He had a big conversation with Dad the day before as well, because his and Dad's relationship was a little bit more fractured, I think, because Marcus felt you left us as a family and I stood up into the role, and very much so had that kind of, I guess, when Marcus got taller than Dad, and you could see Dad standing beside him trying to like reach taller, and suddenly Marcus was like, I'm taller than you and now I'm stronger than you, and like then, so, you know, that alpha male kind of,
I'm not scared of you anymore, having spent so many years afraid of you. Yeah, and they became, and then suddenly they got this good relationship, because suddenly I think Marcus was like, well, do you know what, I'm a man now and these are the rules. And like Dad's conversation with Marcus, last conversation as well, was really significant. The stallion that I was riding, everyone hated me on it because it's a stallion. Dad and I fought. Because of the potential danger of it, was it? And I obviously know stallions are dangerous, but the bond I had with that horse is, I still haven't found a horse that I've had that bond with. And Dad and I were trying and pleading our case with everyone, but everyone used to say to Dad, you're so irresponsible, that's a stallion. And he was a horse too, so he wasn't a pony. And I was like, but I swear to God we're safe and we're doing all our precautions, and we're so, like, the bond with that horse is something I feel like I don't know if I could ever replicate it, and it was just so special. But the day before, Marcus said to Dad, I don't want her riding, like Marcus said, I don't want her riding that horse anymore, like you need to get her another horse, I do not want her riding. So Marcus very much so was telling Dad, this is the way things are going to be now. So all the conversations he had were very final with everyone. So I hear you kind of wondering if it's some part of our consciousness that is unconscious. Yeah. Or some part of our unconscious, do we know when we're going to die? And you often hear people say that it's like she knew, or it's like he knew, or a part of him knew. I don't know what the answer to that is, but it sounds like you're putting together pieces of a puzzle to create meaning out of Marcus's death, and part of that meaning is, at some level, you think he might have known. I think that's maybe what has helped us on our journey, because we're able to kind of say, okay, do you know what, that last hug he gave you was his last hug, and that hug meant the world to Mam. And you know, I think she often reflects on that. So for her, when she's grieving, that's a huge significance for her. With Granny, that last day she spent hanging out with them, they just went walking back in the fields, and Granny often says, and it's, I don't know where the quote originally came from, so I'm not going to say it's Granny's quote, but she said it to me often, and it's, when the field is white with daisies, I'll return. So we do have a field that is literally becomes like a field of daisies. So Granny every year loves to go back, and she said every time she sees the field of daisies, she thinks Marcus. And Granny actually went in to see him the next day after he died. The family that weren't in the hospital that night all went in the next day, and
when Granny went in to see him laid out in the morgue, I actually didn't go in that day. I stayed at home. Wasn't there blood coming out of his ear? And Granny had a handkerchief with her, so she gathered up the blood and she still has it. And she says, I always have a piece of him now. So she has that handkerchief beside her bed, and she always says how she has a piece of Marcus with her. And like, it's funny, I think, like, I feel like I'm getting upset now thinking about Granny's love with him, because Granny there's over 30 grandkids, and I think all of them don't mind me saying this, and I say it, and I don't mind saying it. Like, Marcus was her boy, and Marcus was her favourite, and he was the special one. And Granny buried my granddad when she was in her early 50s and had 11 children, and reared them then on her own. So you think by the time we came around as grandkids, she'd been kind of fairly sick of kids. But Granny played a huge role in our lives, because we're the only ones out of the 11 that have parents separated. So Granny very much so took on, like, really stepped up to that role when our parents were separated. I think she was kind of afraid for us. So she
became a mentor as well as a granny, and a presence in your lives. Yeah,
so she's always been huge. Like, but I always say, like, after Marcus died, I feel like a bit of Granny died that day too.
Yeah. And I think something that isn't said a lot about when a sibling dies, like for you lost your sibling, but so many people say, how's your mum?
Yeah.
As opposed to, how are you doing?
Yeah.
And for you there, not only did you lose your brother, but you also lost your mum as you knew her.
Yeah.
Because a parent is irreversibly changed when they lose a child. What was that like for you, Meghann?
I always say, like, I think nothing can ever be taken away from a mother. I think a mother's grief, I feel, is the most awful, because I think a mother has obviously carried this child and brought them into the world, and I always would never try take my mother's grief away from her. And I think a parent, and especially a mother, losing a child is just, it's just so hard to even comprehend. But definitely there became a lot of anger built up within me, because I had to be the parent. And not only did I have mum, but I had dad as well, who was very much so going through a real angry, guilty phase. Mum was going through a very sad phase. So I had two parents going through two different emotions of grief at the same time, and I genuinely felt like I was trying to juggle both of them, and I was trying to keep them happy. And I oftentimes remember thinking, I felt that I wasn't good enough for them, and I used to cry into my pillow at night begging God or a higher power or someone to send him back and take me, because I genuinely thought that they wouldn't miss me as much. I actually thought that they would be better off with him alive and not me. And in recent years I've spoken about this to Mum, and Mum was like, oh my God, I can't believe, I'm sorry. She's like, I'm sorry that you felt like that. And she was like, but they were so consumed in their grief for Marcus that sometimes I felt like I was forgotten. And I was like, and I used to sometimes say, like, but what about me? I'm still here. Can you not carry on with me? And it took me a long time. I'm
still alive, and I still need your love, and I still am here.
And it really felt like that, and I was like, am I not good enough? And it took it for a lot of years for me to admit this to Mother, and then for my mother to also, we've now have conversations about it, and we're like, no, now we're okay about it. But it took a lot of years, and in those years I definitely built up a lot of resentment and anger towards everything in life, because I just suddenly felt like I wasn't good enough.
And I don't know anyone who's lost a sibling who has had a different experience to that.
Yeah.
I think it's really common to see your parents fall apart with grief and yearn so much for their dead child that the surviving children or child just feel so abandoned, and it's nobody's fault. It's just the way the dynamics land, but incredibly painful. So Meghann, I know much later on, you went on to write a book called A Broken Love.
Yeah.
But before that you had another tragedy just 18 months after Marcus died.
Yeah, and I kind of at the time couldn't believe this was happening, but after Marcus died, like, we all got sick. We got chest infections, we got kidney infections, we got flus, our immune systems were on the floor. I mentioned earlier, Mum was a vegetarian. She started eating meat after Marcus died again, because she was wasting away in front of us. And I think there definitely wasn't the veggie cuisine that there is nowadays. So we all, as a family, were like, you have to eat meat. Like, you need to eat. Obviously, our diets, everything was just awful. And we just got really sick. And then Dad started to get sick too, but obviously he had underlying issues and he couldn't battle the common cold and flu the way Mum and I could.
So he was very compromised, being a kidney transplant survivor. And you said something about, well, maybe it's irrelevant how long people can live after such a transplant, but he'd kind of defeated a lot of odds, put it that way.
Yeah. But
after Marcus died, he stopped trying to defeat the odds.
He was known as like the Iron Man and the Bionic Man, and everyone used to joke because Dad was literally like made of steel. It was like, how does this man keep bouncing back from triple heart bypass, all these like heart problems, all these hospital submissions, and he'd always sign himself out. Not advisable, but doctors, I'd say, used to see him coming in. He'd be literally coming in dying, and then a few days later he'd check himself out to go to the RDS horse show, and the doctor's like, what are you doing? And he's like, I'm not missing the horse show. So he was just this, like, I think I'd say he was a bit of a medical mystery for a finish, but his desire to live, I think Dad deep down knew he didn't have long to live ever. I think because he cheated death so many times, and there's so many times he should have died that he didn't. I think maybe he knew he was going to have a short life, so he was going to make the most of it. But after Marcus died then, I think that was the ultimate, like Marcus being 18 and taken away in a flash. Definitely guilt. I think Dad was riddled in guilt for all the surviving he'd done for all his years, and then suddenly his son just get taken away like that. And Dad actually went to South Africa not long after Marcus died for a holiday and stayed gone for 5 months. And we were at home grieving, and I was like, Dad, like, why aren't you here? And the horse was like left in a stable, and I'd go down and ride him out, but nobody wanted me riding the horse because the stallion, and it just was getting really complicated, and it just was a really messy time. And my mum then met a new partner as well in the middle of all this, and he had just moved in with us, and it was just a very messy time because Mum was still horrifically grieving. Andrew had just come on the scene. There was a new man around. My dad was MIA in South Africa.
Who was Andrew?
Andrew is my now stepdad.
Okay.
So poor Andrew.
So he came on the scene and stayed on the scene.
Andrew is the saint. Yeah, and I refer to him as a saint. Andrew came in not long after my brother died, and I often say to him, because now we've such a good bond, I'm like, you came into our lives at possibly the worst time ever. And I was like, I don't know how you stayed. Like, his mum literally cried all the time.
A grieving mother and daughter. It's extraordinary.
It was incredible. And he said he remembers their second date. She was cooking dinner and he was sitting there chatting to her, and he said he looked up at one stage and she was just stirring whatever she was stirring, and she said she was just crying, and she just cried and cried and cried. And he said then he knew then straight away that he wanted to stay with her, and he knew that he could see past the grief, and he wanted to stay with her, and he wanted to be with her at this awful time. And I'm like, and I was going through a really horrible teenage time because I was also battling with hormones. I just buried my brother. My father was MIA, and it was just a very difficult time.
You probably were like, who's this guy, and get him out of my kitchen.
Yeah, pretty much, yeah. And I was like, get him away from me. But he wasn't going to leave us, and as much as I was like being awkward, like I was giving out because we had a telephone with a cord, and I was like, I can't talk to my friends in private, so he went off and got us a cordless phone. And then I think I was giving out one time that the television was old, so he went off and bought a new flat screen television. So he didn't know what to do, so he just kept buying these things. He'd hear me giving out about them, and then I couldn't be giving out anymore because he just kept buying these things, and I was like, oh my god. And then he stayed there, like he wasn't going, and I was like, why is this man staying? But he's a saint. But in the meantime, Dad came back to South Africa, and it was like he just came back a completely different man. He was really withered and sick and just gone, like dead in the eyes. And
so we say with grief, it's often like a stress response where we go into fight or flight. Your dad went for the flight. Yeah. And he literally left the country. Yeah, he
disappeared, and then by the time he came home, I remember it was coming up to my birthday, and I was like, in October, and he'll be back for my birthday. He wouldn't miss my birthday. And then he didn't come back. Again, thinking I was daddy's girl and putting myself on that pedestal. And then for him, obviously I was battling with the whole idea that I wasn't good enough for my parents because, I thought Marcus should be saved and I should be taken. And then when obviously Dad didn't come back for my birthday, it really hurt me because I was like, you're meant to be here with me. And then eventually arrived back in November, and he just was a completely different man. But then that Christmas, I knew he wasn't well, and that Christmas though we spent the Christmas together. We had some really lovely times together, and he brought me to my first black tie ball, and we did loads of really fun things. And then he's like, oh, I'm going to hospital now in January, and I've got some stuff done and surgeries, whatever. And I was like, oh, okay. But I was so used to Dad going to hospital. It was like Dad going for a holiday. It wasn't like a significant.
It wasn't on your radar as something to be worried about, even though he did look very different.
Yeah, and I kind of was like, oh, he'll be fine. But then Marcus's first anniversary rolled around in March, and Dad didn't turn up. And up until the readings, the prayers of the faithful, we had my Aunt Imelda reading out a prayer of the faithful for Dad, and we 2 versions: the version of Dad being here and just out of hospital, and Dad still being in hospital. So we said to Imelda, literally up until you start the reading, take one last look, because we were like, he's not going to miss Marcus's first anniversary. He's either going to arrive by helicopter, he's going to come up on a gurney, like he's going to arrive, and he didn't. And then after that I was like, okay, this is actually very serious. And then as the summer wore on, he came out of hospital a few times, but he was like, it was like he wasn't really there. And I think he was, at the time, I think he was on so much morphine that his mind wasn't really right, and he was hallucinating, and he would ring me in the middle of class. And I have to say, the school were so good to me. I'd moved schools in the meantime after Marcus died, but it's a local school as well, so it was like, it wasn't a big move.
Did you move because of your bereavement or unrelated?
No, I was in like all girls convent, and I was at the stage where I was like, I can't do this all girls school anymore. It didn't have the sisterhood that the boarding school had with the boys. Okay. And I was like, I don't have that same. It was just the dramatics of the all girls school.
It's extraordinary that, actually, isn't it?
Yeah.
How boys tend to bond better than girls in the teenage years.
And I always say, if I ever have a son and daughter, I will absolutely send the son to a male boarding school, and I would absolutely send the girl to a local mixed community school, because I was Marcus who I won over, because Marcus was like, you're absolutely not going to the local mixed school. And like Mum was like, no, I don't really want you going there. And Dad was like, absolutely not. And I was like, oh my God. So then eventually I won Marcus over, and he was like, okay, I actually can, I'm on your side now. So then he won Mum over, because Mum, when it came to Marcus, Mum was a pushover.
So he intervened for you.
Yeah.
So his 1 year anniversary was March, Meghann. And then when did your father die?
Then on the 12th of August 2006, it was during the RDS Horse Show, which was his favourite holiday and our favourite holiday together. And it was between the Puissance and the Aga Khan, which were his 2 favourite competitions. So he did it his way, and his funeral song was Frank Sinatra, My Way, which was the most fitting song for someone ever. So he did it his way, and again around 2:15 in the morning, kind of around the same time as Marcus, Dad took his last breath.
Were you with him?
I was with him. I held his hand. A lot of people were in the room. It was in a private room. A lot of people in there. If I was old enough, and if I was I obviously was under 18, so I wasn't next to kin, and my parents got a divorce not long before Dad died, actually, so Mum wasn't next to kin. So Mum wasn't allowed to be there, which was a huge tragedy, I think, because he was asking for her in his last week. He was like, I want to see Pauline, but my mother wasn't allowed to attend, and that was something that really affected me for a long time, but we've both learned together. Mum and I together have let it go.
So family members wouldn't facilitate that.
Yeah, and even though they're divorced, they were great friends. And the fact that he asked for Pauline, I think he wanted to kind of say his piece to her, and I think he knew he was dying now, so he knew it was the end. So that was a really sad moment that Mum couldn't be there.
And these are other huge losses, you know. These are the things that really exacerbate her grief, you know. If only to have had that chance.
Yeah, and I think, Mum has since done a lot of healing herself around Dad, and now we've both done so much healing, and I remember coming home that morning, early hours in the morning, I got dropped home, and Mum opened the door to me, and I was like, oh, he's gone. And then Andrew said, then obviously I remember I sat in the sitting room straight away. I hadn't slept all night. I'd been with Dad, and I just sat on the floor, and I wrote a poem to him, because poetry is something I've been doing. And at Mark's funeral I read the eulogy, actually, and for Dad I wrote a poem. And Andrew said to Mum, will I leave? Will I go home for a few days and leave you to it? But Mum was like, no, stay here. And at the time I remember being like, oh, why doesn't he just go? But then I remember after a few days I was like, thank God he was there, because he was doing all the driving and doing all he was just there, and it was to have him there as a support meant more than anything else. And that's the kind of man he has been to us now, and Andrew's always there. Like, he's so reliable, and he's such.
And you could have done with your mum beside you as your dad was dying.
Yeah, and I needed my mum to be there, and even in the funeral, my mum wasn't allowed to sit beside me. Again, it should have the two of us should have been sitting together, arm in arm.
Absolutely, and this you know, I hear people say I'm not allowed. Who? You know, okay, people can have an opinion of what they want, but like at the end of the day, gosh.
There's nothing like a death and funerals to really destroy families.
Nobody's place to bully anyone into whether they should be or shouldn't be there.
Yeah.
And I'm so sorry that happened, and I'm sure Pauline has questioned 1,000 times over what did he want to say to me, or what would he have said, or how might he have said it, you know.
Yeah.
But I'm so glad to know you've somehow found peace, or Pauline has found peace.
Yeah, we have, and it's I guess we both went through different grief journeys at the same time but separately, and then we both came full circle, and we were both able to rejoin then and kind of realise, okay, we've done this, we've gotten through it, we've done it together. We talk fondly about Marcus all the time. We fondly talk about Dad. We've great memories now, the two of them. Like any of the bad or sad memories have kind of fizzled away, and it's the happy, good memories now that are at the forefront. And we're both, as I mentioned, like I found it really hard to let go of Marcus and Dad for years. Everything I did was for them. I set up a road safety campaign in memory of Marcus. I let that go then because I realised, what am I doing? Like, he's dead. He doesn't want me to keep he doesn't need me to keep his name in a charity campaign. And I realised I was only doing it to kind of help my grief along the way, but in fact it was kind of prolonging it, because I was suddenly getting stuck in with road safety campaigns, and it was like, oh, wait a second, actually I don't want to do this. And then I always felt I always really strongly believe in hearing and feeling Marcus and Dad around me, and I really do feel their presence, and I always feel like when something comes into my head, I always kind of feel like it's them putting that in there as well at certain times. And I just knew that I needed to do things on my own, and for a couple of years I couldn't do things without Marcus and Dad. I had to be like, okay, well, Marcus never got to do this, so you have to do it, and Dad didn't get to do this, so you have to do that. But then after a couple of years I realised everything I was doing was
in relation to them.
Yeah. And it was kind of, wasn't really living, it was kind of surviving. And then I realised I was like, I have to do this on my own. I have to step out on my own without them. They can join me on the journey, and I always think of footprints in the sand. They can join me on the journey, maybe carry me the odd time, I said, but I have to do it on my own. And like, that's what I learned to do. And it was the most kind of painful experience. Like, even though we're saying you're not on your own, obviously I've learned through years that you're not alone with grief, because everyone's going through it at some stage or another. But it is a kind of for me it felt like there was a path I had to go down on my own. It's
like childbirth. Nobody else can push that child out. No matter how many yogis or doulas or midwives, you are on your own giving birth, and grief is exactly the same. You're on your own with your thoughts, your feelings, your emotions. There might be people around you, there might be amazing support, but it is such an internal process that only we can do, you know. Yes, with support, but it's lonely.
Yeah, it is. It's incredibly lonely, but I think, you know, when you're in that kind of loneliness, and when you're on that dark path on your own, you kind of learn to survive, because you have to. So when you're on your own, you're like, well, I have two options here. And I remember the last significant panic attack I had, I was over in London. I was on my own that weekend. I think the two girls were gone away, so I was completely on my own. And I'd come back from a night out, and I just had a massive panic attack. And usually when I had panic attacks, there was always someone there that could help me. And I remember them being there, being like on the floor, literally down on my hands and knees, not being able to breathe, like panicking, grasping for air. And I remember then just thinking, you have to get yourself out of this. There's no one here. You're on your own. It's London. It's like whatever, 1 or 2 in the morning. There's nobody here. There's nobody you can call or text right now. So you have two options. You either stay here on the floor and panic, or you actually sit up, breathe, and pull yourself out of this. And I can safely say, like, that is the last panic attack I had, because I was able to do it on my own. And doing that on my own kind of gave me a bit of sense of achievement, that I was like, oh, okay, I can do these things. So for me, it was kind of taking the baby steps, getting through things one by one, and then suddenly realising I actually can do this. I actually do. There is a strength within me that can do this. There is a want within me. There's, I guess, probably a bit of pride as well, and just that kind of, you know, competitiveness, probably the bit of stubbornness from my dad that just wanted me to, I didn't want to just like survive anymore. I wanted to thrive. I had to do that by myself initially. I had to.
And that's, I mean, we chatted earlier, Meghann. You told me a little bit of your story, and you talked about that pit of grief that you were in for quite some time. And in a way, you know, it's a delayed grief that we often see. Well, I often see in young adults, and it's where, you know, maybe their grief wasn't adequately supported at the time, or when it needed to be supported. Or like in your case, where you went from one loss right into another one, a lot of life changes. I mean, you changed school, there was a new partner in the house. You know, you were quickly into your own leaving cert year, leaving school, going to college. So it's like your grief was being pushed away as you went through all of these life transitions. But it was there all the time. You talked about the weight on your chest, feeling like you were having a heart attack, panic attacks, drinking too much. I hope that's okay to say. You know, drinking till you blacked out. Like, you weren't okay.
No, I was
You weren't okay at all.
No, I was definitely on it. The self-destruct mode was on, and it was purely reactive to the grief that I could no longer face. And I think as well with the whole drinking too much to black out, I think because I knew that when I drank too much, all the emotions came spilling out of me, and then I'd be mortified the next day that people saw me crying, but then I knew it had to come out somehow. And the only way, it seemed at the time, I was such a good bottler, and I could bottle up so much, and I could like really keep concealed. But then suddenly I'd hit a limit of drink, and I knew if I stop now, I'll be fine. But if I stay going, you're going to erupt. And then I'd be like, I'm going to stay going. And then I'd erupt. And then I'd drink then to blackouts. And then the next day I'd pretend then to everyone, oh, I don't remember anything from last night. But it was a coping mechanism to kind of cover up and pretend that I didn't remember bawling my eyes out in front of everyone the night before on the dance floor. So it just became a real self-destruct. And I knew then the alcohol was making me really depressed on top of the grief. But then I was using the alcohol as a crutch as well. And it just became real, like, I was no longer enjoying the student lifestyle. I was kind of neglecting my emotions, and I was neglecting myself. And, you know, I had to take a step back and realise what I was doing was wrong. And like going, and it's funny now when I see people now and I see them blacking out nights out, I'm kind of going, right, something bigger going on here now. There's something going on under there. I feel like now I can almost spot things in people, because I spot myself. I'm like, I see myself in other people, and I'm like, okay, this person has clearly got a lot going on, and they seem to be using the alcohol as a crutch, and that's what I did for a long time. But I remember I knew I didn't like the person I was becoming. I pushed away our relationship. I pushed away all my friends. I'd lost my community was completely gone, and all I had was my mother. And I remember thinking, nobody wants me. Again, nobody wants me. Abandonment. Again, everyone abandoned me. Even though I pushed them away and I pushed my boyfriend away, I just was like, well, he abandoned me.
And you know what? Look, it's so, like, I'm so grateful you're sharing this, Meghann, because these are the parts of grief we don't see. These are the parts of grief we don't talk about. For anyone who can't see Meghann, like, you are physically stunning, you know, and Meghann is an author. You're young, a successful author. You've written a book. You're a broadcaster. You're a journalist. You're about to flower out there, aren't you? You know, and anyone looking in would go, she's got everything, you know. Like, as we often do, we look at people and we make assumptions and, oh my God, she's got everything, like, you know. But it's so important to understand that what we see on the outside is absolutely nothing to do with what is going on internally. And that goes for everybody, you know, for most of us. And just some of the things you've said there, I pushed away my friends. I felt like I was friendless. I felt abandoned. I couldn't let people in. I felt like my parents didn't want me, like the wrong child died. It should have been me who died, not Marcus. I mean, just a tremendous amount of pain going on here. You mentioned how your social circle shrank, and then your only way to access your grief was through drink.
Yeah.
There's a huge amount of pain over a number of years. It's just really, really good of you to share the reality of that.
I think it's really important to talk about it and kind of let people know that, like, I, at one stage, didn't realise I was grieving, and I thought I actually was losing my mind. I thought I was completely losing my mind, and I begged my mother to sign me into some kind of an institution or into some sort of a rehab centre or something, because I was like, there's something wrong with me, like I've lost my mind and that's it now. And I remember at the time I'd gotten my degree in media, and I had I was completing my master's in journalism, and I thought, what a waste of 5 years, like I'm not going to do anything. I genuinely was like, I'm going to have to move home, live with Mum and Andrew, and just go on the dole for the rest of my life. I was like, I'm never going to become this media presenter that I really want to be. I'm never going to work in this industry that I really want to work in, because my sparkle was completely gone. I remember some people said to me, like, your eyes, your shine is gone, your eyes are literally lifeless. And I knew it and I could see it, but I sometimes thought if I put on enough makeup maybe people wouldn't notice, so I started wearing fake eyelashes all the time, thinking nobody'd see what was behind the eyes. And I did the whole fake tan thing, and I was trying to really put on extra makeup and really cover up because when someone said that about my eyes, I was like, oh sugar, I was like, people can actually see it now. So I was like, I need to conceal this. But I said I did think I was going out of my mind. And then another time, around the same time, I thought I was having a heart attack, and I went to the doctor, and my dad had a heart problem, so I convinced myself that I had some heart disease, and like they signed me up to the machine, and they were like, there's nothing wrong with your heart. And I guess, like, looking back, it was the grief, and it was a broken heart, not a heart attack. But I could physically feel the pain in my chest. I could physically feel my heart was like so damaged from loss and pain and trauma. And then likewise my head was too, because I couldn't understand everything that was going on in every ounce of my body and my mind. But when I did realise I was grieving, it was like a weight was lifted, because suddenly I knew what path to take. And
it's like, thank God I'm not just completely falling apart, but maybe this thing. And I think for so many of us, when we're going through really hard times in life, I know I certainly did and still do, we want a label.
Yeah.
Can we just have a label, please, so that I know I'm not completely insane, and that if I have this label, I can then look up how do I address it or how do I support it. But there's this expression, the gift of addiction, and it's like, if you drink enough or smoke enough or use enough and hit rock bottom, you'll then get to find yourself through the processes you have to go through. And it's really hard then. Grief can do that to us if it brings us to our knees. It can bring us through a process where we truly meet ourselves. But for a lot of people, they don't. It's like the dagger goes in and is removed, but it's not bad enough to need severe intervention, significant intervention. But yet life, community doesn't offer us the insight we need or the understanding we need for our process.
Absolutely. And I just think it's talking to people about it, sharing your experience is something that hugely helpful. And I found with my book and with my Instagram, I do share a lot of honesty about grief. And I think when I started sharing it publicly first, people were like, oh my God. When I started telling people I was grieving, people were like, people that knew me very well were like, okay, we were waiting for this day. People that maybe knew me from the social queen that was always out and partying and really good fun were completely floored. I was like, I wrote a blog post and basically told everyone I'm grieving, and big, huge, lengthy post about how much I was struggling, and I couldn't get over the feedback I got, because people were like turned to me and were like, I actually lost my sibling too, or I lost a parent. And then suddenly I was like, wait a second, we're all the ones that are on the dance floor every night, and we all actually are grieving. And then suddenly this other community opened up to me, and I suddenly now I feel like I've got this kind of almost grieving community on my Instagram where we chit chat, and I know people might talk to me, or if it's an anniversary and vice versa. But like, people now have told me, especially those who are in a raw stage of grief, have said how they get such solace from my Instagram and my life now, because they realise, oh, she's working as she wants to work, she's doing all these things, she seems really happy. And I was like, I actually genuinely am really happy right now. And then I was saying, but it took a lot of work and it took a lot of patience, and I think patience is something I did not have, which I've learned to have. And it took all that, and I tried to say that to my friends who were in a really bad place with grief. I'm like, you will get here. I said, you just have to be patient, which I know nobody wants to hear that.
And so important to say that, like, happiness doesn't exist really. It's like I have moments of joy. I'm able to feel joy, I'm able to feel happiness, but it's not a permanent state. No. Like we will have our moments of joy, we'll be able to dance on the dance floor and have the time of our lives, and 2 hours later, you know, be with the tissues on the sofa at home. And that is life, and that is grief as well. And I think important to say, Meghann, I don't know if you agree or how you feel about this, but we don't get over grief, we learn to live with it. What's your relationship like with your dad now and with Marcus now?
Do you know what, it's funny, when a lot of people read my book, especially family members, they turned around, they all said to me, they're like, oh my God, your father's death affected you way more than Marcus's. And I always felt that too, because even though Marcus was 18 and tragic, and my dad was probably dying all my life, I always felt like Marcus just went straight to heaven. And I always feel like Marcus was like an earth angel that was just given to us for 18 years and 18 days, and that was his purpose in life. And I always really have that very much so in my mind. Yeah, I still get sad about him around his anniversary. When I hear Robbie Williams' Angels, my heart aches. But I think I am so much more grateful for having known Marcus for 15 years of my life than have not known him at all. And so I'm grateful to have had him, and his influence on my life in those short years was the most profound. And he gave me the foundations for so many things in life that are still benefiting me to this day and will probably carry me through. So I always think Marcus and laugh and smile. With Dad, it was much more difficult grieving process, because I found it very tough, because I realised in actually very much so recent years that my parents' separation really affected me, and that constant trying to be daddy's girl, you know, really kind of, I guess in some ways, I kept trying to put myself on a pedestal. He didn't put me on that pedestal, I kept putting myself up there, and I felt like I spent a lot of his life when he was alive with me protecting him, and I always felt like I wanted to mind him. And like when we used to go away, I used to always share a room with Dad, and everyone was like, why are you sharing a room with your father, blah blah blah. And I was like, because if he dies in the middle of the night, he won't be alone. And like that was from a very young age. That's when I was a very little girl, and I did that all the way up until he died, because my fear was he'd die in the middle of the night in his sleep, but if I was there beside him, at least he would never be alone.
And you said something there that was really poignant, Meghann. I spent all my life losing him.
Yeah, and all my life chasing him.
Both from, and that's the irony. And I think, you know, this is a really good point you're making, because it's like your relationship with Marcus was so good, it was clean, that almost your grief is clean as well. You know, there was so much love there. There's something that can be settled in you. Whereas with your dad, you were perpetually chasing it and wanting it and needing it. And then he died, and the relationship wasn't straightforward, and his death wasn't straightforward, and your grief isn't straightforward.
Absolutely.
There's a correlation, isn't there? How it was with them, you know, the bond we have in life is very similar to the bond we have in death. And if it's complicated and painful while they're alive, it'll probably be complicated and painful when they're dead.
Absolutely. And I think as well then I was very conscious, because I noticed in years after Dad's death that I was always trying to find a partner that I could heal, or that I could, and I found then I was always chasing guys, and I found I was always trying to go after a guy, and I noticed that pattern happening, where it was constantly me chasing, or me always putting in more effort than the guy that I was dating. But I think then I kind of noticed that was probably the pattern of my relationship with my father. So in the last year and a half, I've done some serious work. I kind of used the lockdown to really refocus, realign and reevaluate, because I was like, right, I was so upset at Dad's anniversary last year that I realised something's still not healed. So I went back to counselling, and I worked through my childhood trauma, and I went to heal all the pain and all the suffering. And at the start of the sessions, I could feel the hurt and the pain towards Dad in our relationship. And I think I was suffering the loss of the good relationship. I needed that back. And then by the end of the sessions, I'm now able to look back and reflect and be grateful for having Dad. And you know, there were moments we had some really great times together, and I often say that one of my favourite memories is we had the stallion. He was on the stallion and I was on Harry, his friend's horse, and there was no, like, it was just a pure casual, the two of us out with the two horses, and instead of being like, there was no show on, there was no ribbons, and there was no, like, we always had to win best dressed, because Dad all made sure that we always looked the best, and very much so about our appearance. But this day I think we were probably just in tracksuits and boots and threw on a helmet and real rough and ready. and we just took off back to Turlough, and we raced each other back to Turlough on 2 horses, and I won. And like, my dad represented Ireland at one stage, so dad was a very good horseman and has all the trophies and ribbons. I always was tried to be as good as him, and I never could, but it was in those moments where we were just racing each other down that Turlough, and I often think that I remember that gallop because I bet him. It was like, and even he was like, no, fair and square, you bet me. And I was like, yes, I did. And like, it was those that there. So now I reflect on our relationship, and I'm grateful for what he's taught me, because now I've had to, when I say about reevaluate, so now going forward, relationships with men in my life, I now have to realize I can't heal someone, I can't fix someone, I can't chase someone. So I need to I've done all the work now myself, so now I can recognize those traits. When I do meet someone, I can kind of spot those traits straight away. So it's just and I'm also grateful to dad because of the lessons he did teach me, and that he did show me that this is what the real world is like. So yeah, and I think right now I can say like I'm there's no anger or hurt or bitterness there anymore. There's just love and gratitude, and I know and I'm saying, like, I'm not obviously 100% happy. There's going to be days where something's going to trigger me. I'm going to hear a song, or I'm going to, like, every time I still sit in a horse, I'm with dad when I'm on a horse, and I find myself kind of looking around being like, where is he? So there's always going to be those moments where the sadness will peer up and be there, but that's grief. Like, that's, as I said, it's with you for the rest of your life, and it's just learning how to deal with it now, and how to kind of deal with it in a healthy way now that isn't going to damage me or those around me.
Meghann, it's been lovely speaking with you. Just tell us your Instagram handle in case anyone would like to connect with you.
Yeah, it's Meghann Scully, MEGHANN_SCULLY, but Meghann Scully should come up.
Okay, great. And the name of your book and where it's available?
Broken Love, and it's available from bookhubpublishing.com.
And this was your diary when you were 15 when Marcus died, is that right?
Pretty much a diary from all those times, and everything I went through, and all the different kind of healing I went through, and pretty much a decade of grief is in that book.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your story, and I feel obliged to say, being 20 years your senior, it's not all about marriage either. You can have very good, lovely lives without finding, quote unquote, the perfect man, but I wish you happiness in whatever way you find that, and good relationships and lots of them.
Thanks so much. It's great to be with you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Shapes of Grief. This podcast is not a substitute for professional medical or psychological advice, and if your grief is making you unwell, please do see your healthcare provider. Once again, please consider supporting the podcast by donating on shapesofgrief.com or becoming a patron on patreon.com. I rely on your support to keep going. The music is performed by Bacca Beyond, especially for the Shapes of Grief podcast. Until the next time, from me, Liz Gleeson, take really good care.
On a storm-torn shoreline, a woman was standing. The spray hung like jewels in her hair. 'Neath the rock of that desolate landing, oh, as though there were none, she stood there. She has come down to condemn
absolutely gorgeous.